You know, we're all taught that India's first big fight for independence kicked off in 1857. But what if that story is off by a whole century? Today, we're digging into the incredible, forgotten story of a much earlier rebellion, and the man who led it, Maveeran Alagumuthu Kone.
Right, so when you think of India's struggle for independence, one date probably pops into your head, 1857. That's the year of the Sepoy Mutiny, the event that's often called the First War of Independence.
But what if the history books are, well, missing a huge chapter? What if a massive armed rebellion against foreign powers was already happening a full 100 years before that? Let's explore that idea, that the first real cry for freedom was heard long before 1857.
Just look at this timeline for a second. It really puts things into perspective. Over on the right, you've got 1857, the date we all know. But look way over to the left to 1759. That's when Alagumuthu Kone's rebellion met its dramatic end, nearly 100 years before the Sepoy Mutiny even started.
So you gotta wonder, how did this happen? And maybe more importantly, why don't we all know this story? Let's get into it and explore this incredible, forgotten rebellion.
All right, so our story doesn't take place in the north. We're heading way down south to what was 18th century Tamil Nadu. It was here that a local chieftain was watching the growing power of the British East India Company and made a very conscious, very defiant choice to fight back.
So who was this guy? Who was this chieftain who dared to stand against the might of the East India Company? Let's get to know the man himself, the chieftain of Kattalankulam.
Okay, to really get what was going on, you need to understand this term, Polygar or Polyakarar. Think of them as powerful local rulers, almost like feudal lords, who controlled their own territories across southern India. They were seriously the backbone of the region's political and military power.
So, this is Alagumuthu Kone, and let me tell you, leadership was literally in his blood. He came from a long line of warriors who had served the great Chola kings. He became the ruler of his village, Kattalankulam, after his own father died in battle. And his skill as a commander, a Servaikaran, made him the top military leader for the powerful king of Ettayapuram.
And that warrior spirit, well, it leads us right to the core of this whole conflict, and to a very simple but very powerful question he asked. Why should we pay?
The whole situation just exploded with incredible speed. First, the local ruler, the Nawab of Arcot, went bankrupt and basically handed over the rights to collect taxes to the British. To make sure everyone paid up, the company sent in a notoriously ruthless commander named Khan Sahib. But when that demand for taxes reached the king of Ettayapuram, his top general, Alagumuthu Kone, gave him one piece of advice: don't pay. Defy them completely.
His reasoning was just so direct and powerful. He reportedly asked his king, why should we pay taxes to immigrants? For him, this wasn't about the money. This was about rejecting foreign control and defending their right to rule themselves. Now, you can probably guess what happens next. A bold refusal like that, it means war. But this fight against the British was about to get way more complicated, because the biggest threat wasn't from the outside, but from within. Yeah, standing up to the British East India Company meant open warfare for sure. But for Alagumuthu Kone and his king, the most devastating blows weren't going to come from British cannons. They were going to come from the daggers of their own countrymen. It's just tragic. The kingdom was split right down the middle. On one side, you had Alagumuthu Kone and his loyal king, refusing to back down. But on the other side, you had rival relatives who saw the British as their ticket to power. They went behind the king's back and promised the British they would happily pay the taxes as long as they were put on the throne. And this betrayal just tore everything apart. In 1755, the British attacked the fort and put one of those traitors on the throne. In that same battle, Alagumuthu's own uncle was killed. Then, when that first puppet king couldn't deliver, the British just swapped him out for another relative in 1756. In just a couple of years, Alagumuthu Kone had become an outcast, forced to raise a brand new army just to try and win back a kingdom that was stolen by his own family. So after all this fighting against enemies from the outside and the inside, we get to the final, heroic act of his life, the absolute climax of this story: defiance at the cannon.
He's trying to regroup his forces, get ready for one last push, but a spy gives away their location at the Ettayapuram fort. Khan Sahib's forces move in, surround the fort, and launch a surprise attack in the middle of the night.
Alagumuthu and all his remaining warriors were captured.
And he wasn't captured alone. Look at this number, 255. That's how many of his most dedicated soldiers were taken with him. It's a single, stark number that represents the last stand of this entire rebellion.
The captured warriors were then presented with a choice, and it was absolutely brutal. On one hand, they could submit, beg for pardon, agree to pay the taxes. On the other hand, they could hold on to their defiance and face certain horrific punishment.
So what do you do? What do you choose? Well, their response, led by Alagumuthu Kone himself, has echoed through history. In order to safeguard the honor of our motherland, we are ready to accept death.
The price they paid for that defiance, it's just ghastly. For 248 of the soldiers, their right hands, their sword hands, were chopped off. For the 7 commanders, including Alagumuthu Kone, the sentence was even more brutal. They were tied to the mouths of cannons and literally blown to pieces.
It was a horrific end. But even though his life was taken so brutally, his story, that was far from over. So how is this unsung hero's legacy remembered today?
So, when we look back, what's the takeaway? He was a true pioneer of anti-colonial resistance, a fiercely loyal chieftain who was ultimately brought down by treachery, but whose spirit was never, ever broken. He stands as this incredible symbol of ultimate defiance, and today, he's finally being recognized as India's unsung first freedom fighter. And, even though his story was almost lost to history, it's finally getting the recognition it deserves. The government of Tamil Nadu celebrates his birth every year. A documentary about his life came out in 2012. And maybe the biggest deal of all, the government of India issued a postage stamp in his honor in 2015, making sure his story can travel all across the nation.
And that really makes you think, doesn't it? The rediscovery of a hero like Maveeran Alagumuthu Kone and his incredible sacrifice, it leaves you with one big question. How many other heroes are out there just waiting for their stories to be told?